That was some intro. Thank you so much, you guys, and welcome to this panel debate. I'm super lucky to be, flanked by these amazing journalists with amazing stories to talk about a really important topic in a day and age where we are being bombarded with information and there are lesser boots on the ground. And we need more context, more analysis, and more boots on the ground. And what we have here are people who have this unique insight that we're going to tap into today. Stuart Lau, I want to start with you because you are a fascinating role that you have as an EU-China correspondent based in Brussels. And I was immediately fascinated with how you do your work. And I'm super fascinated with China and its role in the world. And I see the need for you in the newsrooms. Tell me more, first of all, tell me more about what your work entails.
Thanks, Shazia, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And so I moved to Brussels about 4 years ago at a time when China became a very interesting geopolitical actor, one that attracts a lot of attention in different political arenas, of course. Unlike other countries like the US or Australia or Japan, where you already have a sizable sort of China expertise among policymakers, among journalists, among think tanks, the same cannot be said of Brussels, the headquarters of the European Union, of course. And the other interesting point being that very often in the EU discussion, we're talking about 27 different countries, 27 different languages, 27 different sets of very domestically focused media outlets. And it's not always easy to have a sort of holistic view about what Europe, quote unquote, is thinking about. So I started by being the EU-China correspondent actually with Hong Kong newspaper South China Morning Post, focusing on EU-China relations. And then 2 years ago, I joined Political Europe, which is headquartered in Brussels, to continue this journey. That's the short story and the short sort of concept about why this role came about and what I'm doing.
Super interesting. Like, we need you and we need all of you and more of you. So in this role, which I find unique, what are the specific challenges that you face in covering the very complex dynamics, which you just outlined a little bit, between European Union and China?
So I think, every job entails challenges. I think, the first thing being that, the fact that I'm based in Brussels means that I'm 13, 14 hours away from Asia, and you don't always get a very firsthand kind of a feel about what's happening on the ground. But of course, the flip side being that I'm based in Brussels, which gives me a very good opportunity to get a sense where things are going across different institutions, the European Commission, European Council, European Parliament, and all the member states, which gives rise to another challenge, of course, which is about having to pick your focus, so to say, obviously you have member states who are more willing to give you an idea what's going on. You have other member states who don't really have a stake, who don't really feel like, they want to overshare, they want to. So again, I think, these are not particularly insurmountable challenge, like in hostile environments, but, it's more like an institutional sort of organizational challenge about operating in this town called Brussels, which by the way, for such a long time was not really used to the kind of media scrutiny as you might expect of the European, of the political significance it entails.
Mm-hmm. The work that you do, who are your readers? Because the question I ask is because, what kind of feedback do you get? Who are you writing for? And how do you deal with the many pressures that we as journalists usually have? Like the readers in China, do they follow your work?
I wouldn't know, but I think, you asked a very interesting question, because in a way, what Political Europe, of course, I'm speaking in a personal capacity today, but, from the media organization I work for, I feel like, a lot of the audience is not what we traditionally call the ordinary citizens, so to say. It's more about the EU policymakers. It's a very niche group of, officials, diplomats, think tankers. I'm sure there'll be some interest, among ordinary citizens when the stories are less technical. It's more about, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I wrote a story about how the British Parliament for the first time referred to Taiwan as an independent country. And that story attracted a lot of attention, of course, in Taiwan, as you can imagine. So it depends on the story ideas, but from time to time, I feel like, most of the attention would come from within what we call the EU bubble, the policymaking circle.
Right. So this is an interesting question, and I always wondered this, regardless, like all three of you, but have you observed any differences in the way the official sources talk to you, deal with you as an Asian correspondent compared to, say, an American or a Norwegian or a European white person?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, even if that was the case, I wouldn't be able to tell, since I'm only living as an Asian person, so I wouldn't know how they would treat a non-Asian person in my absence. So that's not a question I can fairly answer. From what I can tell, I think people appreciate having more China expertise, more Asia perspective, more a closer look at EU-China relations, EU-Indo-Pacific relations in Brussels. Because as you can imagine, in Europe, wherever you have a China expert in Europe, he or she would immediately be sent to Beijing as the China correspondent or somewhere in Asia, rather than staying in the European capitals to write about the stories from that perspective.
Right. I have Pakistani background, so I know that when I talk to sources with the same background, they talk differently to me than they do to my white colleagues. Like they're more open, they're more verbal and vocal, and maybe sometimes even rude. That's my experience. Like how, especially sources, which like obviously have the same background as I do. And for me, that's been very prominent through my career. But you haven't, but maybe it's because you are in this special circumstances in this city with, as you say, your readership is not like normal, like ordinary people, rather policymakers. And maybe they kind of handle themselves better. I don't know.
Oh, I feel like, it's just, yeah, it feels different to me personally from what you just described as your experience. Also partly because I don't, from the workplace I work in is also quite multicultural. I mean, of course, for you, it's not a particularly big challenge for me in that sense.
Right. Maybe my experience is very Scandinavia specific or Norwegian, maybe. But as a EU-China correspondent, like what really interests you? What are like your favorite sort of interesting and important topics that you like to report on, that you want to, like, where are we heading? What should we follow? What are the stories that we should follow now?
So I think we're having a lot of true European experts in this room, so I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in that sense. But I think what's really interesting, of course, is the constantly shifting geopolitical landscape, how the quote unquote rise of China is making the West, quote unquote, rethink its position. With, of course, the last few years before the Biden administration in the US, we had the Trump administration who was constantly pushing different European countries to take a tougher line on China, and how the sort of Biden administration sort of continued that in a different, more subtle, more diplomatic way, and how different European countries are responding to that. You have, for example, the Netherlands talking about more technological semiconductor kind of restriction against military uses by China. Also, I think, the Russia war against Ukraine gives Europe a very sort of sense of urgency about, the interlinked sort of geopolitical landscapes across different theaters. And that's also making people rethink about the overall picture, because for such a long time, Europe thought, China was such a faraway topic, it doesn't matter to us. But now things are changing.
Right. Everyone take notes. We'll get back to you, Stuart. On my right here is Maryana, Drach. And I'm so honored to have you here, Maryana, because you are, let me get this correct, Ukrainian Service Director at RFE, RLs, and you have a degree in international studies, public administration, and we were at in the same term at in Oxford here in 2020. Ukraine, so there's a war in the heart of Europe, and you are like in the heart of the news that comes out, like you are in charge, and it will be so important for us to get your perspective on how it is for foreign correspondents and freelancers to report from the war zone, from an active war zone. You follow the news all over the world, I presume, Maryana. What do you feel all of us who are not there, who don't have boots on the ground or the same sort of stake in the game, are missing out on? Like, what are we not covering?
Thank you very much for your warm introduction, and it's an honor for me to be here. In terms of what is missing, and if I can compare how Ukrainian media cover what is happening and how international outlets, so the first answer would be when the war has started. Ukrainian media would not say that the war has started in February of 2022. And this is something which Ukrainian public will not accept, because the war has started in 2014.
Right.
So this is to understand how this is perceived in Ukraine. And we often see, even in international reports, not necessarily in headlines, when the war has started. So the first thing is and also terms are very, very important, and how media describe events. To me, the big major event that happened was the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine that happened in June of this year. So you probably remember this big ecological catastrophe for Europe and the world. Many compared this to Chernobyl because of the consequences and how the media reported. So some Western media reported in headlines that Russia blamed Ukraine and Ukraine blamed Russia. Soon after, many Ukrainian editors went to their social media pages, and one of them said that this is the day of mourning over Western journalism. Because this is a question of the context, who would benefit from that disaster. And to its credit, New York Times later wrote an article that the body of evidence suggests that the Russia blew up the dam. Some media, but not many, decided to change the headline. But this is something which is strongly and very negatively perceived in Ukraine. And very often we see reaction of the government, but normally independent journalists should not care what governments say, because the country is at war, it's attacked. But Ukrainian journalists and many leading editors said that it was not correct to portray a situation like this in the headline or at the very beginning of depicting what has happened. Another thing is about the war is how generally, and I'm saying the perception in Ukraine by Ukrainian journalists, they criticize their Western counterparts for basically neglecting Ukraine for many years, for thinking that Ukraine is a proxy of Russia. So for many, many years after collapse of the Soviet Union, Western journalists would cover Ukraine and other countries from Moscow. So you would have a very important report that what is happening in Ukraine with byline Moscow, and this is how. So this has been criticized a lot. But this is also changing because different Western outlets now opened their bureaus in Ukraine, including Washington Post, so they're sending people to in New York Times, and they're sending people to Ukraine, but sometimes they're sending their Moscow bureau chiefs, which is also criticized by the Ukrainian journalists who think that this is again why there is this, and the line goes on to say that why there were wrong calculations about whether Ukraine would be able to resist at the very beginning. There were assumptions that Kiev will fall in 3 days. And so in Ukraine, you would often hear an opinion. So one of the reasons for that is a lack of attention to that part of the world. And that goes, that precedes journalism. It goes back to academia and what we know about this part of the world and how it is taught in Western universities. So now you would see also, like for the first time, Britain had the professor of Ukrainian contemporary Ukrainian politics and contemporary politics in Manchester. So they just opened this position. So it's one of the steps that eventually, and it's not only about Ukraine, it's about also other parts of the world, how countries are perceived.
Yeah, well, Maryana, you brilliantly outlined why we need better foreign correspondency, like why this role is so important, because when you lack enough resources, we are not doing our job, and you're talking about false balance in news and the narratives that are portrayed out there, very, very insightful. But on the other hand, like, what do you think foreign correspondents in that area, in Ukraine, like from Western countries, do they have anything to contribute? Are they doing anything good in the area now? Because I remember when the war started, my news room, like VG, sent correspondent people. Like there was a team that were there for days and weeks and in bunkers. Like there were a lot of newsrooms and a lot of newspapers who actually sent people in the war zone who reported live, and they still have, like, people are still reporting. There are still boots on the ground. So my question is, do you think they add anything? Like, do they have unique perspective or that distance that you maybe need to?
I think that the unique perspective is there. I think that international reporting from Ukraine is extremely, extremely important. And I don't know the latest figure, because Ukraine keeps changing regularly its rules for journalists to cover the country. But until May, when Ukraine again changed its rules, there were 15,000 accredited journalists, fixers, producers to cover events of the war. And we are counting, of course, local journalists, but international media. And before the full-fledged invasion has started, my colleagues would be telling me that there are so many international media there, because there was this feeling that something is coming. So there were a lot of international media there. And I think that newsrooms that actually are prominent, that gain international recognition, are extremely, extremely important of covering the war, of observing of what is happening, deploying really thousands of people, because New York Times, for instance, received one of the Pulitzer Prizes for its investigation of a massacre in Bucha, which is a town near the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. And they say that they had 1,000 people. Imagine, only New York Times had 1,000 people reporting about the war, of course, not necessarily from front lines across the globe. So this international effort was there. Data journalism, in my view, is extremely, extremely important, because now people go on social media, including the Russian military. It is possible to track movements. It is possible to use satellite imagery, and international media is doing this. My newsroom is also using satellite imagery to track movement, to uncover mass graves of people when we hear from Moscow that no crimes were committed. So this work is extremely important, and also collaboration, because as you mentioned about teamwork, before the full-fledged invasion in my media, in our newsroom, we created one of the channels, Teams channels, and colleagues, journalists from different countries, including Russia, Belarus, and Ukrainian service. We were trying to fact-check information, and it was very, very helpful at the very beginning, because we, is this true or this is not true? So it was very, very important. And also later, because for instance, in our case, we collaborate from journalists from other teams from Russia as well to investigate what was happening after the occupation, tracking Russian military via their social media pages, also talking to them and see who allegedly committed crimes during occupation. So big international media have this advantage of this collaboration, and I think that there are many good examples when other groups journalists decided to collaborate, let's say, with lawyers, and to tell the world about what was happening. And another example, I mentioned New York Times, another example which is prominent in my view is called Reckoning Project. And it's a group of different journalists from the United States and also Ukraine and also some other countries, where journalists cooperate with lawyers and try to gather evidence to present it later to international courts. So I think this is a very good and important example, because even from this Reckoning Project, some articles would appear sometimes on the front pages of Western media, because reputable journalists with excellent storytelling wrote good journalistic pieces about what was happening and documenting the situation.
Yeah. So important also, like you already talked a lot about collaborating, just gives us a sense of how important the journalist community is working across borders. And you told me yesterday you're having, you want that data-driven journalism also locally, but we need more, we need to work together in different newsrooms to get the proper and comprehensive story out. Do you help foreign correspondents, other foreign correspondents, with the context and with the understanding of the conflict? Do people come to you and ask for help? And how do you provide? Because you started with telling us what we get wrong, what many of us get wrong, right? And how do we get it right if we are outside Ukraine or even at the front lines? How can we, make sure that we're not representing a picture which just gives us false balances and a wrong narrative? Should we talk to you?
I think that listening is important, in any field and in journalism especially. And I think that collaboration is important. And I think that we can only welcome if different newsrooms will collaborate with the Ukrainian reporters, fixers, and actually listen, not only to collaborate, not only ask to do this or do that, but also hear what they're saying. So to me, this is an answer, and this might be changing with more Western media having their boots on the ground in Ukraine. But also we know that sometimes story is written in, one country, edited in another country. So I think it is important, and in my view, Ukrainians are also willing to listen, because this year alone, there were, despite or amid the war, there were 2 major journalistic conferences discussing actually this, and collaboration with foreign correspondents. So in my view, Ukraine is open to this. I attended in May Lviv Media Forum. This is the largest media event in Ukraine and also in Central Europe. it was not, last year, it could not take place because of the full-fledged invasion. Now in the parking lot, in the safe location, they would want, I'm sure, to hear and to listen and to interact with Western journalists. This year, there were people from CNN, from Liberación, and after that conversation, some newsroom decided to actually send more reporters and to collaborate more with local journalists. And this is specifically the case of Liberación. That was the announcement after that event. So I think that if there is an interest, there are venues for this collaboration and for discussions. First, there has to be an interest in doing that.
Of course. Thank you so much, Maryana. Yeah, so listen, that's an important cue. Over to you, Saleh. But before that, everyone here and everyone watching us on live stream, please note down your questions. I will open for questions in a short while. But first, Saleh, Maryana talks about listening and how, you know, sometimes foreign correspondents from countries far away misrepresent the realities on the ground. You come from Yemen. You are a prize Emmy Award-winning documentarian, and you work also freelance now. I want to know about your views on how the Middle East, particularly Yemen, has been misrepresented by Western correspondents, and what impact does that have on the public's perception of what's happening in Yemen?
Great. Thanks, Shazia. Thanks, everybody, for joining in this discussion. Well, first of all, is before I address the question, and I'll talk about the Middle East and that part of the world. Well, the Middle East has sadly been synonymous with the conflict and instability from the 20th century throughout the 21st century, starting from the Israeli-Arab conflict, the Arab revolts in 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then the rise of the extremism, the ISIS, or the so-called Islamic State, or Daesh, and then the war in Syria, the war in my home country, Yemen. So back to the question. There is general consensus among I hate to generalize, but the fact is that there is general consensus among the people of the Middle East that they've been let down by Western media due to the lack of scrutiny on big powers. I'm not talking about the West, but the big powers and their role in the conflict in the Middle East. So there are supposed to be more scrutiny over their role and their involvement, so that people are aware of their governments and their role in the region. But there are several ways of misrepresentation, which is very common if you're just seeing pick up a newspaper, see a piece, or just online and see a piece about any part of the Middle East, and then you will see definitely the simplification of the conflict and explaining the conflict, which is because it's not easy to explain conflict and just sitting behind the desk and somewhere and then just explaining very complex region. That led to failing of the capturing the nuisance and intricacies of the conflict. Another ways of the misrepresentation we're seeing is the just focusing on the conflict. It's just conflict in the Middle East. It's just a war. But there's more than that. There are some interesting stories. There are some successful stories over there. So we need to shed light on that and reflect that too. Another factor is the lack of context. They don't bother to look back and look at the historical context of these issues. Just one example, in the explaining the war in Yemen, they look at it from the lens of just 2015. Well, that's not correct. The war has been there since 1994. It's become more intense, but if you want to address these issues and talk about it, you need to give this historical context so that people are well informed about the situation there. Just lastly, is the neglecting of the local perspectives. Look at, if you pick up again a piece and look at the voices there, it's just some officials, Western officials discussing Yemen. Where's the local perspectives? The local politicians, the local actors, social society, do we talk to them? Are there the perspectives, are they reflected? No. And that has a huge impact on the general perception of the region. I'll just mention two things here, which is the ineffective policy. If you're looking at the policymakers here, how do they get information? They got distorted image because of the reporting with those foreign correspondents they're making. And this will lead to incomplete policy towards the region. If you ask, for example, a UK politician, do you have actually a policy, a single policy towards Yemen? No, they don't. They're looking at it through the lens of the regional partners. That's the way they look at Yemen. And that's why we're not seeing solution. The war has been now since 2015 and still continues. There's no end in sight. And the other impact is the ignorance of the positives. As I just said earlier, you're just looking at it from the conflict lens. But what about the positives there? It's not just negatives, there's some positive stuff there. And that would lead to lack of collaboration with things like the audience here seeing that just Middle East is just associated with conflict, and there's no way to collaborate with that part of the region. We can't deal with that part of the region because of the because of the stories we are seeing there. So, but if we are just focusing, shedding light on the positives over there, then that would lead to some kind of collaboration between that part of the world and the other part of the world, like say the West or the East or anywhere. So that is just about the misrepresentation and their huge impact, negative impact to be exact, on the situation there. Thank you.
I think you speak both for Yemen, for Middle East, for Asia. I mean, there's the entire part of world where I just recently read somewhere that it's just 20% of the world's population who lives in a free country, in a democracy. The rest of the world is not living under the freedoms that we take for granted. And that puts a lot of importance on what we actually write about and how important it is to tell the stories because you want to not only about the conflict, but also humanize the people that's there so that we can, also do solution journalism. But you are a freelance journalist now, Saleh. How do you feel that being a freelance journalist differs from, say, being employed by a regular newsroom as a full-time foreign correspondence? Like, what edge do you have over foreign correspondents? And what can you bring to the table in the coverage of Yemen or Middle East as a freelancer?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, freelance journalists have distinct experience and advantage compared to foreign correspondents, full-time foreign correspondents. I'll just highlight the one part of it, which is the local knowledge, the local expertise, the understanding of the social and political dimensions of their countries. I wouldn't expect a foreign correspondent to know better than me, because it's my home country, it's my country, I know it better. You might just, as a foreign correspondent, you have a course, 10 months course, intensive course, and then you read about that part of the world and you think you're an expert. No, you're not. And that local knowledge actually plays a vital role in the coverage. It's a complementing role. So when they both work together, that would help to produce some quality, balanced reporting. So we need that complement between the freelance journalists and the foreign correspondents to help better inform the world around us.
But how do you think newsrooms, Western newsrooms are treating freelancers and fixers? Like what can they do better?
Well, it depends actually which youth organization we're talking about. I think the kind of treatment varies from company to another. But generally speaking, freelancers need fair compensation. They need fair deal. They don't want to be just used or exploited. And then as a freelance journalist, you're on the call, like a doctor. You can expect, you just expect a call at any time from someone in Brussels, because it's, and then they pick up the call and say, it's blah, 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 we need, there's something happening, can you help us? Da, 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 da. The next day, another call from Dubai office. And then, yeah, that is, so I don't know, call, doctor, which makes it really hard for you, because you don't want to let them down. Always you need to embrace them, like I'm up to it. So that is very challenging, actually. But apart from the fair compensation and the fair deal that editors and should have with their freelancers, they also need to provide safety and training. There have been cases where they take freelance journalists to the front lines. Not in HS front lines, no, the bombing front lines, the war front lines, where they don't even offer them life insurance. You don't know what's going to happen if something happens. You're dealing, okay, you're working with a foreign correspondent. If something happens to him, a plane would come directly from somewhere and they pick him up and take him to hospital or whatever. But what's going to happen to the local journalists? They don't even know what's going to happen to them, because they don't even discuss it with them. But yes, they're pushing to take you to the front lines, but they don't want to take responsibility of the consequences. So if they don't even provide the training. There were cases where you have an agreement just with this editors or their colleagues to report on the situation, but at some point they say, hey, we need to go to the front lines. So you got the training, you got all health, safety training, but I don't have that one. You could have just provided that to me, and then we can go together to the front lines, because they're putting the freelancers in a very difficult situation, because if he says no, it just gives bad impression about it, and you don't want that. And if you say yes, you're going to go, then there's a huge risk of losing your life. You're putting your life at risk. So this kind of selfish treatment coming from the big companies should be addressed seriously.
But Saleh, talking about this and what you say is so powerful, but how common is this exploitation, as I said, of fixers and freelancers? How common is it? Do you get these stories from your friends and people that you know in like war-torn countries and Middle Eastern countries? Is this common, this treatment?
I believe so. I've never seen a freelancer or fixer who has life insurance when they take him to the front lines. I've never seen that. Yes, the foreign correspondent, they do have for sure, but not with the freelancers. So I've seen that many times. And there have been times actually when these freelancers been taken. Okay, you do a story with the freelancers. The freelancers or the fixers play the vital role in, let's say, exposing something, big stories to make the headlines. Okay, you left the country, but this freelancer is still living in the country. And then when the story comes out, you're sitting somewhere else, and those freelancers will pay a heavy price. They've been taken to prison, they've been jailed, they've been even tortured. And what actions have they taken, these big companies, to address this? They're not doing anything about it. All they've been doing is just maybe picking up the phone. Okay, in the news, that's it. So, but are you taking any actions? Are you doing anything about it? Are you now? What happens with my colleagues being tortured, put in jail, and now living in exile because of the reporting he made with these big companies?
You said something also about Saleh, about bylines not being given.
Well, bylines and recognition is very important. We need to recognize the work. I mean, I have other actually colleagues, freelancers who play a big role in making big stories, and these news companies got big awards for their work, and they didn't even recognize the role of the freelancers. That's that's heartbroken. I wouldn't expect that, but it shows the nature of these big companies. That should be seriously addressed, taken into account, and I'm expecting maybe legislation around it to address it, because that is exploitation. The same thing with bylines. This should be given recognized, having their bylines in the stories, not just a tagline. No, we need a byline. There's a huge difference between having a byline and having a tagline. So we should have the the contribution. We just need a fair deal. If we have this collaboration with the freelance again and the reporters, I think we will help produce better quality, balanced reporting.
I think that's a fair demand, a fair deal. So what you are, what you're telling about, and the picture you're painting is really grim. And I think some of it has to do with money, right? I mean, newsrooms are struggling, they're cutting down on people, on journalists, locally and outside, but obviously fixers and freelancers in other countries might be cheaper. I don't know, but this question is to all three of you. What do you think motivates a newsroom in how they kind of prioritize, using a foreign correspondent or a freelancer? Like what kind of stories they choose to make? What is the driver? Is it the money always? Like, how do they prioritize? Maryana, especially you in a middle management role.
Prioritize foreign correspondents versus local people. Well, sometimes foreign correspondents cannot basically get the stories that local freelancers can get, and freelancers can certainly work independently. And since I think that you raised, Saleh, very important points about the role of freelancers, and in my view, because we heard this when we were fellows several years ago, 3 years ago, in London, there was a big conference, and producers were awarded and fixers. So their efforts in global newsrooms, in my view, to recognize the role of freelancers, fixers, producers, not to the level maybe of bylines, but to the level of better protection of people that produce together with foreign correspondents stories. And I can say in our case of our newsrooms, we provide life insurance to freelancers that travel to frontline. But in a country like Ukraine, there is no guarantee that you will be killed far away from frontline, being just in Ukraine, because the shelling can take any place and no part of the country is immune. So in terms of financial aspect, of course, it is important. It is expensive to cover the war. Insurance, transportation, it's extremely, extremely expensive. And we have to recognize this. But this is the cost of providing information to the world.
And what about the ethical side of it? Stuart, do you have any thoughts on this? Money constraints, ethical constraints, and how we use our resources, both our newsroom resources and resources elsewhere through freelancers.
I suppose there's also a legal dimension to it. For example, when it comes to foreign media organizations operating in China, of course, they send their foreign correspondents inside China. But when it comes to the newsroom assistants, the local workforce, so to say, it's always arranged by the government. And that's the deal between the government and media organizations. That's not even a deal, that's actually a regulation by the government. So obviously, it's not just about ex-media organization sending a foreign correspondent to China and then just hiring whoever he or she wants to be the news assistant. It simply doesn't work that way. So I suppose there's also that dimension to take into account, because not every place is as free as Ukraine, or when it comes to hiring supporting staff, so to say. Yeah.
Before I ask this last questions, please, if you have any questions, not before. Okay, let's just open for questions, and then I'll end with one. There are a lot of hands here. Oh my God. I'll start with you in front here, Daniela. Your hand was up first. And then you, Karen. And so just let's start with these two, with Karen.
Thank you for that amazing panel. It's for Maryana, the question. What do you think in terms of coverage if this war lasts for many years, as many political analysts are predicting?
Well, it's a very good question, how long it's going to last. So my view is very similar to the view of majority people in Ukraine, according to polls. So most people expect that this will be a war will last. And so it is important to remember for us when we are, planning our coverage and thinking about our people. So we are encouraging journalists to take rest and to have some time for their families. It is extremely important because psychologically, it is very, very difficult to cover the war. It's not for people that covering the war on the ground, local stuff. It's not the war number 9 for you or number 10. This is maybe your only war of your life, and you don't know how long it's going to last, especially if people are hearing that maybe there will be a ceasefire, but then in a few years again, this will continue again. So there is not, I don't think that it is realistic to think that everything will be settled very, very soon.
Karen, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt and the glasses.
Thank you for a really great conversation. This is probably more for Maryana and Saleh, is in terms of these freelancers and fixers. I am Karen Percy from Australia. I'm the head of the Journalists Union. And one of the things we have been doing for freelancers, we have a freelancers charter of rights that we are starting to roll out to big organizations, and it sets down very specific rights and responsibilities. Would something like that be possible in the areas that you're talking about, that there's a document that you as a freelancer, Saleh, send to a big organization to say, these are my expectations, and this is something that has been endorsed perhaps by the RISJ or the International Federation of Journalists. Organizing and standing together is so important, but how realistic is that in an industry that is increasingly splintered, where people are often isolated? Because I think that's one answer to it, but is it realistic?
I don't know whether it is realistic, because it very much depends on the freelancer, because some of the freelancers that we work with are sometimes staffers of other media companies, and media companies are open for them to collaborate with other media organizations. Who is this person, a staffer of that media company or freelancer of another? So I think it's a question, would depend. Right now, there are efforts in Ukraine to introduce one press card for different journalists. So there are efforts inside the country to make it more streamlined and also more organized. So I think it depends on individual situation. But sometimes, governments demand a special, like, national press card or something like this, or the member not yet exists in Ukraine, but there are some journalistic organizations that are accepted by the government, and these organizations are criticized by other media groups. So it's a question, what should be the universally accepted role of that press card? It can be a freelancer or a staffer.
What about you, Saleh?
Yeah, I would just
Is it possible?
Yeah, I would just echo what Maryana was saying. It depends on the companies, the news organizations, but we need such regulations. I think I saw something similar here in the National Union of Journalists in the UK, but more of regulations I think should be in place to help support the freelance journalists, and some regulations where these big companies should adhere to before hiring any freelancers. That is kind of fair deal that both parties should have.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Tomasz Augustyniak. I have been actually a foreign correspondent in Asia for a little bit over 10 years now. And if I may, I have two questions. So first will be about representation, and second will be a little bit more general to all of you. So the first one, so you have been talking quite a lot about Western media and the coverage of the war in Ukraine, but I guess that one will be for Maryana mostly. How do we find the coverage of the war in Ukraine in the global South? Do you think that global South citizens are well informed about the war in Ukraine? Because we know that especially the developing countries of India or the developed countries in Africa perceive the conflict and Russia indeed as a little bit differently, or very differently, massively differently from it is what is being perceived in the West. So how does the coverage of the war evolve in the global South, and do you see any ways to fix it in any way? Really briefly to Saleh, so you mentioned that you did mention a lot of problems with the ways the war in Yemen is being covered by Western media, and the brief question would be, to what extent do you think it is about resources indeed? And do you see evolution, or rather devolution, of how it is being covered throughout the years? And then the general question about the foreign correspondence as such. because we do know, and what Shazia, you mentioned at the very beginning, we do really, everyone, each country, whether it would be India in Europe or China in Europe, or we Europeans, I cover Asia mostly for Polish media, so in Asia or in other parts of the world, but to some extent, it is a matter of resources, scarce resources, or ignorance of editors or the CEOs of the media and so on. But how do we make the craft of a foreign correspondent more attractive? Because we have been seeing also a lot of people reluctant to join the ranks of foreign correspondents, and a lot of people moving away from journalism and being foreign correspondents to PR, to business and so on. So how do we make the craft and being a foreign correspondent more attractive? Thank you.
Just that last question, I can just tell you, like in Norway, everyone, they're really sought after. They're few and far between. So people really want to do it, but they're not enough like proper foreign correspondent work to do. So that's how it is in Norway. It is very attractive. That's my opinion. But your first question was to Maryana. So we'll take more questions. There are a lot of more questions. Just keep them short so that we can fit in a lot of questions before we take lunch. Maryana.
I will answer very briefly, but before I answer a question about Global South, I would like to add something about freelancers, if I may, because we mentioned about freelancers that they're risking their lives at front lines, but my newsroom is also dealing with freelancers that work at the occupied territories. And there are already several cases when these people were put behind bars. In 2017, two of my colleagues were put behind bars in eastern Ukraine, and both of them were charged in espionage. Later, 2.5 years later, they were exchanged in a prisoner exchange. So they're free right now. And what we did as a newsroom, we tried, it was a big dilemma. What should we do not to risk their lives even more? But we decided to speak about such cases. So this is real risk for freelancers behind bars. And there is another case which is still going on. And I would like to mention the case of Vladislav Yosipenko. He is a freelance correspondent who worked for our newsroom, and he covered Crimea, which is occupied by Russia. He was imprisoned in 21 before full-fledged invasion. Initially, it was a 6-year term. It was then shortened to 5 years, but it doesn't matter. He is still behind bars. He said that he was tortured. And what we did in his case, we speak on every possibility. We ask Ukrainian diplomats, politicians, whoever, what can you do about him? We recently asked Ukrainian foreign minister. He said, oh, we need third parties to resolve that case. So basically, Ukraine cannot do much to release civilian prisoners in Crimea. And yesterday, there was an important development for our newsroom, because yesterday, European Union imposed sanctions on additional people in Crimea and people who were putting him behind bars and allegedly torturing him. So it was an important decision, sanctions by EU against 6 people, and 5 of them are related to his case. Regarding Global South, unfortunately, I am not able to tell you how the war coverage has changed in Global South, but there is a perception in Ukraine that the Global South does not know much of what is happening. And there are very big initiatives by Ukrainian journalists who are covering the war for foreign media to bring to Ukraine media from Global South. This is something that Ukrainian government supports. And, it is impossible sometimes for local journalists to get a high-level interview, but media from Global South can interview Ukrainian president, they can interview Ukrainian civil society officials, whoever. So I see now a lot of efforts by Ukraine to explain to Global South countries what is happening by bringing reputable journalists from such countries to Ukraine. There are different panels that I mentioned, Viv Media Forum. There was also discussion about Global South there, and also Ukrainian diplomacy. Ukraine started to hire diplomats in Global South countries that it never had, before, for whatever reason. So now I see a very big effort by the government, but also some Ukrainian NGOs that understand the region to have more contact. So there is this demand in Ukraine, and I think it will continue in the future for sure. Well, maybe I am.
Saleh, do you remember your question?
I think he's talking about the resources.
About the resources and also whether you see the situation improving or rather, getting worse and worse when it comes to this issue that you mentioned before.
Yeah, in terms of the resources, I think news companies are in a better place to address this question. Is it a question of the resources but from my own point of view I think it's not about resources, because there's a argument, is it worth it? Is it worth the investment? Because we're putting like life insurance or whatever. So the question is, I think it's about the worth it or not. It's not about I think they have the resources, they have the budget, but they don't have the good intention actually to deal with it. And yeah, that's but as I said, maybe news companies and newsrooms, they're better to address it and talk about it. And in terms of the is it the situation? Are you talking about the situation on the ground or the situation on the coverage? Well, I don't see any progress. For example, I'm just talking about the Yemen, Yemen war. It is called the forgotten war. So they've been forgotten for some time and continues to be in that position, that place. So that is why we don't see actually any actions from the big powers to intervene and put an end to that war, partly due to the lack of coverage. So we as journalists and news companies, I think, should play a better role and a bigger role in that, and we help decision makers to put an end to that war.
Can I add a point?
Thank you. Yeah, sure, Stuart.
Just about the global south point, I think it's also very important to bear in mind that for a lot of these developing countries, their media organizations are much less resourceful, of course, which means that there's always a political vacuum for authoritarian governments to have deals with state news agencies, just pumping news onto those newspapers and media outlets. Therefore, they're getting, the false perspectives or the biased perspectives about, because subscribing to Reuters or AP is not the cheapest deal in the world. So obviously there's such a big, not just business decision, but it's such a politically motivated decision as well.
Important point. Let me take some questions from this side and I'll come back to you guys. Okay.
So basically just follow up with what Stuart just said. It's just a quick questions. As you said, you are a foreign correspondent, like in Europe, which is like 7 or 8 hours behind Asia time zone. So what makes you think you're better positioned to cover China or better than those onshore in China and Hong Kong?
No, for me, my customers or, the audience is not really based in Asia. So it doesn't really matter that much in terms of the time zone for me. I mean, of course, it gives me room to have a sort of half-day collection of news already happening, and that gives me enough time to get proper responses from to try to do the follow-ups for the whole day in Europe, for example, based on what's already been happening.
Smaller than that story run in 30 years.
You can say so.
Can we take a question from this gentleman on the first row, and then the first row?
My name's Mark Giorgio. I spent 30 years at BBC, 15 working as a foreign affairs producer, and I was a fellow in '96. Very quick one for Stuart. Do you feel the eyes of the Chinese state upon you? And if so, what difference does that make to your reporting? But just let that sit for a second. Maryana, okay. First of all, I completely and utterly agree with you about the 2014. I went to sleep in Ukrainian-controlled Crimea, and I woke up in Russian-controlled Crimea, and London were calling it an annexation. And I was saying, it's not an annexation, it's a bloody invasion. It's an occupation. Do you not get this? So agree with you on that. Here's the thing. So when I joined the BBC 35 years ago, a foreign correspondent was a middle-aged white man who probably came to this college. Over the years, that changed slowly. It became more diverse, more women, And then gradually, we started to employ a lot more local journalists. And I have one of my colleagues here as the head of the Vietnamese service. Now, here's the thing, I've been thinking about it, the limits of localism. So, for example, would it be appropriate for the BBC to employ a Ukrainian national as an on-screen reporter? Or would there be something about that that would balk against sort of BBC values? Now, in a way, it doesn't matter because we all know that behind Jeremy Bowen and Lise Doucet and Orla Gerlin and Quinton Sonnewill are fantastic teams of Ukrainian fixers and drivers and translators and the rest of it. But is there a limit to the localism of the foreign correspondent? The trend is to employ local people to report on their situation. But are there limits to that?
You go first.
You go first, Stuart.
State.
Well,
Whether the state follows you.
I think, you know, well, first of all, thank you for your question. I think, you know, again, it's such a confused understanding about what my role entails. My role is not about reporting China. My role is about reporting what Europeans are doing in their China policy making. It may sound very complicated, but the short answer is my role is not to go to the foreign ministry's press conference in Beijing every day and ask questions.
No, but that's not the point now. It's almost because your role is your role that I wonder if you feel that you're being observed even.
I'm sure they read it. I don't know if that amounts to observing, so I can't tell.
But you don't feel pressure.
No. No, if I feel pressured, I wouldn't be doing this job.
Maryana.
And about BBC, it is hard for me to answer again, what is the perception of local on-screen talent here? Because it depends on the audience perception, and any on-screen talent would have an editor, right? So he or she cannot, you know, go beyond to the editorial policy. So I think that BBC journalists, I know that BBC journalists from the Ukrainian service, they did contribute they did contribute stories to the global BBC. So this is happening already. But do you need more of this or less? This is hard for me to judge. But I think these contributions are authentic, they're important, especially if reporters are on the ground in Ukraine and, you know, they can get, you know, share with the audience very important nuances. Like sometimes it is very difficult to appear on screen and to dry your hair when there are power cuts in the country. Right?
Gentleman on the front seat.
My name is KP Nair. I was a journalist fellow in 1986, the third year of the Reuters program. I want to ask the views of the panel on an issue that has been troubling me as a foreign correspondent, which is an unwillingness in the Western media, especially the American media, to see the truth and report the truth. The problem has become more intense with the recent changes in geopolitics and geoeconomics, particularly with the culture of being embedded, which started with the Iraq war in 2003. And I will illustrate my problem with an example.
Keep it short,
yes,
because we are running out of time.
Yes. I went to Syria in 2011 and 2012. And I was the only correspondent from the United States who legally went there. You know, everybody else sneaked in from Lebanon or somewhere else. And I came back with the opinion that Assad is going to stay. I mean, years have passed, so I can tell you. The Israeli ambassador, my sources, I can tell you, the Israeli ambassador in Washington told me that we want Assad to stay. Don't believe what we say in public, because We have a peaceful border in Golan, the most peaceful border, unlike Lebanon or the border with Egypt. Why would we exchange this peaceful border with trouble, with a troubled border? Then the equivalent of the Pope of the Orthodox Church.
Right.
the
What is your question?
Sorry?
What is your question to the panel?
Well, my question essentially is, how do we deal with this problem? This problem of increasing unwillingness to see the truth and report the truth, you know. I won't deal with Ukraine because we have Maryana, who's an expert here, but especially reporting on the Middle East, like Syria is the best example.
Saleh can answer that question. The question is,
The unwillingness, increasing unwillingness since the culture of being embedded since 2003 among the Western media to see the truth less and less and report the truth.
Well, the embedding culture, I think, doesn't help proper balanced reporting, and you don't need to. Why would we go? Why would you just be embedded with the army? You don't need to go there if you're going to be embedded with them.
How do we deal with this problem? I mean, this is an increasing problem, you know, in the media, especially in the Western.
I think there is a
And
way.
Syria is the best example.
Yeah, I know there's a way around it. There are different channels. I know the safest way is just to go to be embedded with the army, with the soldiers. That's a very safe way. But there's a way around it. If you have the right connection and the right channels, there's always a way around it. Through the freelancers, the local fixers, they can, I think, help. But if you are avoiding contacting the local fixers or the local journalists, then I find just a safe way to do it, then you'll be just embedded. So simply just need to be connected with the local fixers or the local journalists who work on the ground to help.
I'll take a couple of more questions. I see 4 questions, but they have to be questions and super short. I have 2 questions from the ones who are watching live. So we have like 6 questions in 10 minutes. So just please keep it short. 4 more questions. The gentleman in the white and then the gentleman in the blue, and then we'll go over to you guys.
Yes, hi, thank you very much for your perspectives. I'm James Miles, foreign correspondent, political correspondent from Extra Bird in Copenhagen. I have a question going off a bit on what was said by the gentleman over here about surveillance or being observed. How have you, if you have, noticed or had any suspicions about being surveyed or observed, either politically, digitally or physically? I was covering the summit in Vilnius this summer, and I got a call from our rental car company because we were close to the Russian border, saying that we needed to get the hell away, and that was, of course, intimidating. But I'm just wondering if you've had any experiences that you could share, and how that affects your journalism and the way you do stories.
Anyone have any hints that they're being surveilled?
I think more and more you see a lot of digital trolls on Twitter, for example, when you post like, critical stories, and of course, part of it personal experience, part of it observing what other journalists are doing, I think, that has become a sort of a psychological warfare, if you like. It's not just about showing up physically to tell you what you can and cannot do, right? It's about creating this massive threats, like totally meaningless, insults, derogatory stuff against you and what you're doing. I think that's sort of the psychological warfare that they're trying to mount on certain journalists.
We'll just take the next question.
Okay, thank you. I was very interested in Saleh's point about, the lack of reporting of other subjects when there's a war going on. And I mean, I guess this applies to Ukraine as well. To what extent, can you get editors to take stories about things that are not just the front line or the fighting in those circumstances? And it might be relevant to Stuart as well. I mean, I covered China myself, and if there's something like the crackdown in Hong Kong, it's very difficult to do a story about, say, cuddly sociological issue somewhere else in China. So I just wonder what the panel feel about how realistic is it to cover other stories in a time of war or crisis. Thank you.
Saleh?
I think it's very, I think it's realistic. If we just have the right resources to do it. So, for example, it's still related to the war. There are successful stories, good stories, but still related to the war. You don't have to go away from the war. No, it's very related to the war. But successful, for example, the struggle of women who started their own business during the war. That's an interesting story to tell. There are entrepreneurs during the war. That's an interesting story. And there's more stories to tell, very related to the war, but good. It shows us the good, the positives out of this in that part of the world.
There are two last questions.
Giang Nguyen, editor for Visual Division in London. First, I may want to answer one question here about engaging with the freelancers. Well, I think it's World Service to have an engagement form and on the details, and the payment and so on. But when I'm managing freelance reporters from Vietnam, obviously Vietnam is not free. So some of them even don't want to buy line. And some of them even don't want the money because they don't want any money trail. So it's admiration to them. But I don't know about other big news organization, but in World Service, trying to take care of the freelance reporters. But I have a question to Maryana, because we've been covering Ukraine and the war by Russia for a long time. And I just come back from Bangkok, and in Southeast Asia, actually Sputnik and Russian media in the local languages, say in Vietnamese, is very strong. And they are allowed to tell literally everything. And the local media put them. And they put Russian correspondent in Vietnam speaking Vietnamese on state television. So I just wonder if anything, Ukraine government or big media groups can literally send their correspondent to those countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam. Probably the governments cannot say no because they only have the Russians in their country. I mean, the Russian working for Moscow. And we see that the war is raging in the local media, in Chinese, in Vietnamese, with sort of sometimes 60% on the side of Moscow. And the question is what the Ukraine can do,
Right.
to counter that narrative.
I think that what you suggested is exactly right, that Ukraine can actually offer, if it has Vietnamese speaking people, to suggest to interview them. I know that there were efforts not by the government, but some of the Ukrainian NGOs to present to foreign media Ukrainian experts that are English speaking, that can speak about different topics that are necessary. And I think that in India especially, this is, I know that some of the Ukrainian experts that later participated in some of the news programs, they were quite surprised to see their counterparts or people from Russian state media also on air. So this issue definitely exists, and I think that there are ways to deal with it. And thank you, because you're actually echoing the same observation that the situation is very worrisome.
Yeah. The last question.
Tim Ripley, I'm a former alumni of the program 1991. I've also worked as a war correspondent in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And I understand very greatly that the pressure for journalists when their own country or their own allies are engaged in a conflict. And we see this, in the the Ukraine war. Ukraine is at war. NATO countries, Britain are supporting them. It's national policy to support Ukraine. But in World War II, famous Prime Minister Winston Churchill had a dilemma about this, and he posed it like this: in a time of war, the truth needs to be protected by a bodyguard of lies, where we have to, and that was a view that you have to lie on behalf of your country. But then he said, well, that ain't worked so far. We've got to announce our defeats, so when we win, people believe us. So, and for Maryana, how do Ukrainian journalists view that dilemma? Because on several occasions, the Ukrainian government has come out with statements that are unbelievable and easily unbelievable, and it really damages their credibility to make these statements. And you have a big crisis with the Nord Stream pipeline. You know, how do Ukrainian journalists report the Nord Stream pipeline if it is true that the Ukrainians blew it up, which is quite highly likely? And it would be very bad for Ukraine to actually be portrayed as blowing up the pipeline, and causing an ecological crisis in the Baltics, all that stuff.
So the question is, can we trust that Ukrainian journalists are non-biased? So this is an important question, which is important for the West, I guess, not for the Ukrainian journalists, but this is a fact that Ukrainian journalists live in the country, they report the war, they have no place to escape, that many of Ukrainian journalists are in the armed forces, and some of them were killed as civilians, some died as members of the armed forces. So it is there. But at the same time, I think that before full-fledged war has started, Ukrainian journalists, Ukraine had a very vibrant journalistic community with more than one independent media outlet. And another issue which is also widely discussed without this specific pipeline issue is the corruption and allegations of corruption in the government. And I would like to point out that it is the Ukrainian journalists that first uncovered stories about issues with procurement in the defense ministry. They went public with this in January. There were some resignations, eventually dismissal of the defense minister who denied any allegations, but there are cases against his deputies. And then, we hear statements from the higher authorities about this issue of wrongdoings, from procurement to conscription, and different steps by the government. But first, we heard about this from the Ukrainian media. So I think that Ukrainian media does its job in controlling the government. Of course, we can say, do more of this or do more of that. Some journalists, I think that there is to a certain degree the issue of self-censorship, but not only by Ukrainian journalists, but also by some foreign journalists who can sometimes openly speak about this at the journalistic conferences. Is it necessary to report about this right now, or I have to do this tomorrow? So this is something which is, because it's not a theoretical discussion, it's a full-fledged war where one country is saying that people of another country do not exist and should not exist as a nation. So it's not theoretical, it's life and death issues for many people. But at the same time, I think that there is a growth of investigations about crowdfunding for the army, who are the people that are collecting money. So I think that the media is doing its job in Ukraine of controlling not only the government, but also some civil initiatives, and whether somebody is benefiting from that.
That will be the last word spoken today. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you for listening, those who are watching the live stream. Thank you for the brilliant questions. Thank you to this brilliant panel, which gave us such amazing insight. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Very good, very good, very good.